Hello, everyone, and welcome to this online discussion on translation as transhumans. This evening's session, at least evening here in the UK, forms part of the annual Summer School organised by the British Centre for Literary Translation in collaboration with the National Centre for Writing. But it's also one of our public sessions, and I'm aware that we have plenty of guests joining us this evening as well. So a special welcome to those joining us for the first time. My name is Duncan Large, and I'm the academic director of BCLT. We have a 90-minute session in prospect, and we'll be opening up the discussion to your audience questions for at least the last half hour. So do please use the Q&A function for any questions that you would like to put to the panel. Do please upvote any other questions that you would particularly like to have answered. You can also use the chat function for comments, for sharing links, and so on. The event is being recorded and will be available on the BCLT YouTube channel after the summer school has finished. Our session this evening focuses on the book from which it takes its title, and that is the book Traduire comme transhumé by Mireille Gansel, translated into English by Schwartz as Translation as Transhumans. Traduire comme transhumé first appeared in French in December 2012, published by Éditions Calligramme in Rennes, France. Roz's translation appeared in November 2017 with the Feminist Press at City University of New York in the US and the London-based independent publisher Les Fugitives in the UK. A second UK edition with a translation of the original preface to the French edition and an afterword by Roz was first published in November 2018 and then reprinted with a colour photograph on the front cover in December of last year. And that's the edition which you see on the slide here. The book was longlisted for the Jan Michalski Foundation Literature Prize in 2013. Roz's translation won a Face Foundation French Voices Award in 2015 and an English Pen Award in 2017. It was selected by Gabriel Giuseppevicci in Times Literary Supplement's Books of the Year 2017 and by Sophie Collins in the White Review Books of the Year for 2018. We're delighted then to be able to feature this terrific book this evening then. If you don't yet have a copy, then I'll put a link to Les Fugitives website in the chat just now. In thinking about this book, we have to start with the title image of Translation as Transhumans. So let me share my screen with you again and we'll switch back to the PowerPoint. Translation as Transhumans. The central image of transhumance. We're familiar with how translation is a metaphor that refers to a physical action of carrying across, linking translation with space and place. Mireille Gansel's book takes this image a step further by evoking transhumance, which is a particular kind of carrying across. Quote, the action or practice of moving livestock from one grazing ground to another in a seasonal cycle, typically to lowlands in winter and highlands in summer, as the dictionary would have it. The title metaphor emerges relatively late on in Gansel's text when she's visiting the poet René Char in Provence. And she writes this: that little Provençal road made me think of transhumance, the long, slow movement of the flocks to distant places in search of the greenest pastures, the low plains in winter and the high valleys in summer. All the ancient routes that have witnessed encounters and exchanges in all the dialects of the umbrella language of Provençal. So it is with the transhumance routes of translation, the slow and patient crossing of countries, all borders eradicated, the movement of huge flocks of words through all the vernaculars of the umbrella language of poetry. By this stage, we've already been on a journey ourselves as readers. The book is an autobiography told in the first-person voice, but it's not a continuous narrative. Rather, it's a loosely structured series of vignettes or cameos, episodes in the life of a translator, spread across short chapters of just a handful of pages. The book itself is only just over 100 pages. Broadly speaking, it falls into 5 sections. It opens with reminiscences of Gansel's extended Jewish family, their relation to languages, and the traumatic political events of mid-century Mitteleuropa. The next section takes us through Gansel's education, an early school trip to East Germany, and her encounters with German, the language, and East German poetry, especially Brecht and the lesser-known poet Rainer Kunze, whose work she would go on to translate. In the early 1970s, Gansel was invited to contribute to an anthology of translated Vietnamese poetry and moved to Hanoi. The book then brings us abruptly back to Europe and a residency at the Translator House in Arles in the 1990s to translate the poetry of Nelly Sachs. The final pages of the book are devoted to Eugenie Goldstern, the Odessa-born Austrian anthropologist of Swiss alpine folk culture. The book depicts Gansel herself as a kind of nomad, moving between cultures and landscapes in a kind of transhumance, but putting down roots wherever she can. It is at the same time a profound meditation on poetry, language, and translation. The book is in search of a way of understanding translation itself, hence the periodic characterizations of translation scattered around the book, often at the end of a short section as a kind of punchline or moral of the tale. Now, Mireille Gansel herself, unfortunately, can't be with us this evening, but she is going to be represented in a number of ways. Firstly, visually, here is Mireille Gansel. She has sent a short welcome text, which Ros has translated and which I will read now. Mireille writes this in Ros's translation: "Dear friends, I'm grateful to the organizers of this event because it is going to take us on a great transhumance route, greater than the one that crosses only one border. This evening, we're going to discover the crisscrossings of several borders and how the hospitality of each language, each land that is other, enriches our own reading, opens up new horizons for our own language, reveals new dimensions of the original text, unsuspected by the author herself. Yes, how the diversity of approaches and sensibilities, how the many ways of listening enable us better to hear our own voice. Not to mention the joy of encounters on that long road that is translation. The cover of each of the editions of Traduire comme transhumé in New York, London, and Barcelona is itself a translation. The Catalan publisher Muntaner has chosen to show the sheep on their transhumance path what is for him the soul of the book and what he calls a path of light. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy this time together. Mireille Gansel." And Mireille there refers at the end to the cover of the recent Catalan translation, which looks like this. This is the Catalan publisher choosing to show the sheep on their transhumance path what is for him the soul of the book and what he calls a path of light. Next, we're going to hear the opening of the text in Mireille Gansel's French original. I'm going to stop sharing my text and start sharing audio. The text opens with an act of translation, a childhood memory of Mireille's father translating letters from the branch of the family that lives in Hungary. We'll hear the opening section now read by the actor Céline Ligère, who unfortunately cannot be with us this evening because she's playing in the Festival d'Avignon tonight, but she sends her best wishes. Here then is the opening of the text in French, and we'll hear an extract from the opening, read now by Céline Ligère.
À l'écoute du silence. Quand une lettre arrivait, le père s'absorbait dans sa lecture, la maisonnée retenait son souffle, il régnait un silence religieux. Assis dans le grand fauteuil, il était soudain très loin. Puis, avec une gravité rituelle, il annonçait « Ce soir, je vais vous traduire ». Personne ne manquait alors à l'appel, ni même ne se serait permis de faire attendre. Je me souviens cette écoute des silences, lorsque le père cherchait le mot juste, ou la construction de la phrase, parfois se corrigeant, se reprenant. Interstice de mystère, fine passerelle de secondes. La petite fille aimait beaucoup entendre les mots qui parlaient d'elle. Qui plus est, de les entendre prononcés par ce père plutôt pointilleux sur les compliments. Il y eut un soir mémorable, car c'est en cet instant que pour la première fois, je vécus de l'intérieur, sans en mesurer encore la portée, ce que cela allait signifier pour moi, traduire.
So, I'm delighted to say that I'm joined this evening by Mireille Gansel's English translator, Ros Schwartz. Ros is a literary translator from French into English who lives in London. Among many other things, she's translated Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's The Little Prince, 16 of Georges Simenon's Maigret novels, and a range of contemporary French works of fiction and non-fiction, most recently Swiss-Cameroonian author Max Loeb's A Long Way from Douala. She's translated a number of Francophone writers, Ousmane Sembène, Fatou Diom, Aziz Chouaki, Tahar Banjeloun, and Yasmina Kadra. She's co-chair of English Pen's Writers in Translation Committee and gives regular talks and workshops around the world. Her translations have won a number of awards, and in 2009, she was made a Chevalier dans l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres. Welcome, Ros.
It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to read the opening chapter of Translation as Transhumance, the section that you just heard in French, and a little bit more. Listening to the silences. Whenever a letter arrived from Budapest, father would become engrossed in reading it. The entire household held its breath and a reverent silence reigned. Sitting there in the big armchair, he was suddenly far away. Then, with ritual solemnity, he would announce, "Tonight, I am going to translate for you." No one ever failed to be there or dared to be late. I recall listening to the silences while father struggled to find the right word or sentence construction, sometimes stopping short and correcting himself. Mysterious gaps, tenuous bridges. The little girl loved hearing the words that spoke about her, and better still, hearing them uttered by this father who was so sparing with his compliments. One evening in particular stands out in my memory, when for the first time I experienced viscerally, without yet realizing its significance, what translation would come to mean for me. It all happened with the utmost simplicity, as is often the case when something is important. To my delight, the section of the letter my father was reading was about me. He initially translated a word used by his brother or one of his sisters as beloved, stumbled over the next word and repeated this actually rather ordinary adjective once, stumbled again, and then repeated it a second time. That triggered something in me. I dared to interrupt him. I asked, "But in Hungarian, is it the same word?" He replied evasively, "It means the same thing." Undeterred, I pressed him, "But what are the words in Hungarian?" Then one by one, he enumerated, almost with embarrassment, or at least with a certain reticence, as though there was something immodest about it, the 4 magic words which I have never forgotten: Dragam, Kedveshem, Aronishkam, Edisham. Fascinated, I pestered him, begging him to translate for me what each word meant. Dragam, my darling, Kedveshem, my beloved, and two other words whose sensual literalness I would never forget. Aranyoshka, my little golden girl, Idishem, my sweet. That evening, I discovered that words, like trees, had roots whose magic my father had revealed to me. Arani, gold, Yiddish, sweet. Each of these terms enriched by a lovingly enveloping possessive. All of a sudden, the blueprint of my native French glowed from within. Those four words opened up another world, another language that would one day be born within my own language, and the conviction that no word that speaks of what is human is untranslatable.
Thank you, Roz. As the co-editor of a collection on untranslatability, I love the way that opening concludes. In particular, thank you so much for your translation and for your reading. I wonder, Roz, if you could tell us a bit more about how you came across the text and how you set about translating it.
Certainly. There's something serendipitous about this book's journey into English and the enriching relationships that it has generated that echoes Mireille Gansel's core belief in translation as hospitality. So Traduire comme transhumé was sent to me by Gansel's friend, the former publisher Nicholas Jacobs, who was determined to see the book translated into English and was seeking a translator to champion it. I devoured the book in one sitting, experiencing that visceral sensation of falling in love. This short, exquisitely written volume, which is an intricate blend of memoir, reflections on the act of translation, and a celebration of the power, beauty, and magic of language, had a profound resonance for me, both personally and professionally. This may sound arrogant, but I had the inexplicable sense that this book had been written for me to translate. Like Mireille Gansel, I come from a multilingual Jewish background and have been fascinated with languages from a young age. My four grandparents only spoke Yiddish. It was the only language they had in common. Like Mireille, I've been a translator for many years. And for me, her succinct observations express the essence of what translation should be. It's the book I wish I could have written. For her, translation is a profoundly political engagement, and she commits herself body and soul to every act of translation. There's no boundary between her life and her work, and I think that's what moved me so much, is that she has lived out her beliefs in her work. And the reason that she ended up translating Vietnamese was because it was her response to the Vietnam War. When the war broke out, she asked herself what she as a writer could do, and she actually took herself to Vietnam and learned Vietnamese in order to translate the Vietnamese poets. And so I sort of fell in love with the writer as well as the writing. And Gansel's writing is imbued with her humanity and her humility and her boundless curiosity. And she has an inquisitiveness that she displays in person. When I first met her, she bombarded me with questions. So strong is her impulse to reach out to the other. I knew I'd have to find a very special publisher to take on this genre-defying book. Serendipity again intervened. A friend sent me the newly published Suite for Barbara Loden by Nathalie Léger, translated by Natasha Lehrer and Cécile Menon. This was the first book published by Les Fugitives, whose mission is to publish French women writers. On reading it, instinct told me I'd found my publisher. I wrote to Les Fugitives, who immediately recognized the unique value of this work. There's something about this book that's touched a chord in so many people and created an entire ecosystem of interest and support. leading to two friendships between all those involved in its publication.
Thank you, Ros. So let me just share my screen again. We'll be hearing more from Ros a little later on, but I want to introduce our next panelist, and I will briefly share my screen in order to do that. Traduire comme transhumé then has been remarkably successful and has been translated into 4 other languages all told. It was translated into Italian by Claude Cazalet-Bérard published in 2014. Translated into German by Walter Schmitz, published in 2015. Ros's translation came out in 2017, as we heard earlier. And most recently then, the translation into Catalan came out in February of this year. Our second panelist this evening is the translator of that most recent version of the book, Catalan translator Dolors Udina. Dolors is a literary translator and has been professor of translation in the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona for 20 years. She's translated into Catalan more than 100 books of writers such as Alice Munro, J.M. Coetzee, Toni Morrison, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and Ali Smith. She's won a number of awards for her translations of books such as Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway and Aldous Huxley's The Demons of Loudun. In 2019, she was awarded the National Translation Prize by the Spanish Ministry of Culture for her life's work. Welcome, Dolors.
Organizer, and to Mireille, of course. Well, do you ask me something or just
Dolors, I know you're going to be reading from your Catalan translation.
Yes. I'll do it first.
Opening a little later on, but I think you were, please, can I invite you to, as I did Ros, to say a little about your relationship to the text, how you came to translate the book and to find your publisher for it.
Okay, thank you. Well, I found this book in a little bookshop in a small village in France, in Banon, and a library that it's incredible, a library with many books. I don't know, it was 100,000, I don't know, many books. And then I found this book. I started reading it. I read it once, 1, 2, 3 times. And finally I decided, well, I have to translate it, even when I translate from English normally. I mean, it's not my, well, I can read French, but it's not my language for translating. But I couldn't not translate it. As Ros said, it's a book that I would like to have written, really, because it's the nicer book I've seen of translation. It's not a book of theory at all. It's just a book of experience, of transmitting experience. And the best thing is how Mireille gets to transmit her way of working, her love of translation. I think this book is a kind of autobiography, but not in the sense that she says, this is what I've done in life, but this is this is what made me the person I am, no? The inner language I have cultivated translating authors. But she's also a poet. I think that's very important because the way she writes, the way she talks, is the way of a poet, of a born poet, really. I think it's the importance of the thing more important of this book is the way she talks of language and her way of going beyond the words to transmit the part of life of humanity that the text contains. I think that this humanity thing, I think Ros said it also, that she says that in everything is translatable when it's human. No? That's a sentence she says. When I read this book, I was reminded of the Middle European literature by writers like Appelfeld, Imre Kertész, Elias Canetti, writers who had grown up with many familiar languages, right? Yiddish, German, Romanian, Hungarian, and had to find their own language to express their kaleidoscopic view of the world. Their way of writing, their vulnerable minority language, a language without land nor borders in general, had to rid itself of many official nuances to describe a world on the brink of disappearing. I felt a great affinity with what's being said in Gansel's book, and when rewriting it in Catalan, also a minority language and quite vulnerable, I had the impression of finding in her text that language and form were intrinsically united. That's something very interesting to find in a book, because I don't know, maybe because I was translating always from English, I had not seen this link between languages. Well, there is always this mystery in translation, literature being mainly language. You have to deconstruct it completely to reformulate it again in your own language. And nevertheless, you keep the spirit, the soul, and of the original. I think that is only achieved through a profound sense of listening, through trying to find out what the silences say, keeping an ear out for what is unspoken, carried through language, smuggled deep inside it. I think this is a very thought-provoking book that gives great value to the craft of translation. I don't stop thinking of it from the day I started reading it. I can't stop thinking of the sentences she says and what makes me think. For those who are experienced translators, it seems to give us the words to express what it is, what we do when we translate. For those who have the aim of getting to be translators, it will open many possibilities and ways to approach your work. Well, I think we will quote many sentences long through this talk, but there is one that I like especially, that says in Ross' translation, it suddenly, Mireille says, it suddenly dawned in me that the stranger was not the other, it was me. I was the one that had everything to learn, everything to understand from the other. That was probably the most essential lesson of translation. I think you said that, Duncan, but when translating a book, Mireille Gansel used to go to see the author to his or her place of living, to talk with them and have a real feeling of their life. Obviously, it is not always possible for a translator, especially for a professional translator, to travel everywhere to meet whatever author you happen to translate. But it is important to bear in mind, and that is a lesson that we learn reading this book, that you don't have to translate from where you are, but have to go mentally in a kind of inner transhumance, where the author is, to listen with attention to him or to her. To translate, you have to put yourself in the place of the other, listen to him or her profoundly to capture what their language carries hidden deep inside it. And after having translated many books, always from English, the translation of this book by Mireille Gansel has been one of the best experiences I've had. Her eager collaboration in solving any doubt, her always encouraging words, and especially all the reflections I made with her and her book have given me a more profound view of translation and the hope of a comforting humanism in life. That's my words. And I can read now a little bit. I just read a little bit for you to see how Catalan sounds. I must put the...
Please do. Thank you, Dolors.
Escoltar el silenci. Quan arribava una carta de Budapest, el pare quedava absort en la lectura. Tothom aguantava la respiració i a casa regnava un silenci religiós. Assegut a la gran butaca, de sobte se n'anava molt lluny i al cap d'una estona, amb una gravetat ritual, anunciava: aquest vespre us traduiré. Ningú no faltava a la cita. Tampoc ningú no es podia fer esperar. Me'n recordo, aquella manera d'escoltar els silencis quan el pare buscava la paraula justa o construïa la frase, corregint-se de vegades, reprenent el fil. Intersticis de misteri, transicions subtils que duraven segons. Hi va haver un vespre memorable, perquè va ser en aquell instant quan per primera vegada vaig viure des de dins, sense mesurar-ne encara l'abast, el que arribaria a significar per mi traduir. I think that's enough to see how it sounds.
Thank you, Dolors. The book is so much about the sound of poetry and the sound of the musicality of poetry and the aural features of poetry which a translator needs to attend to, that we wanted, where possible, to have a variety of voices this evening and not just be sticking to texts on the page or on the PowerPoint. That said, as you were saying before, Dolors, the text is so quotable. I have put together, Ros has put together a kind of florilège of quotations from the text, which we might be raiding at various points in our discussion. I have them on the at the end of my PowerPoint, so we might see some of those quotations and use them later on in the discussion. But thank you, Dolors. I must now introduce our final panelist, our third panelist this evening, and our third panelist is Preti Taneja. Now, Preti hasn't translated this book, but she joins us as a passionate reader of the book. Preti is a writer and activist. Her novel, We That Are Young, published by Galley Beggar Press, won the 2018 Desmond Elliott Prize for the UK's Best Debut of the Year and was listed for awards including the Folio Prize, the Shaktipat First Book Prize in India, the Republic of Consciousness Prize in the UK, and, like Translation as Transhumance itself, Europe's premier award for a work of world literature, the Prix Jan Michalski. It was a book of the year in The Guardian, The Sunday Times, and The Spectator, a top 10 book of the decade in India's The Hindu newspaper. It's been translated into 7 languages and is published in the USA by Knopf. Preti teaches creative writing at Newcastle University. She's a contributing editor at The White Review and at The Independent Press and Other Stories. Her new book, Aftermath, on the language of trauma, terror, prison, and abolition, will be published in October of this year as part of the Undelivered Lectures series from Transit Books. Preti, welcome.
Thank you so much, Duncan and Ros and Dolors, for having me in this conversation to rave about with all of the agreement, the things that you've already said about this remarkable book, which I encountered as a debut novelist who had just published We That Are Young. I happened to be in Paris at Shakespeare and Company and browsing, and it was lovely because I had finished such a huge project myself, and I was looking for some way out of my own head, and also a way to articulate what it means to think about language from 2 countries, which I hold within me, India and Britain. And I came across Translation as Transhumance, and I was just, first of all, entranced by the title, the idea that translation could be thought of, literary translation could be thought of as a metaphor. And of course, I opened this book, this short book, and discovered a work of such profound humility and grace and political power, as well as the way it thinks about poetry, the way it thinks about prison, and the way in which it puts its life experiences together across geographies, which I just found so rare. I think these days, identity is such a fraught issue. And this book really works so brilliantly to dissolve any concept of who belongs where, because of the ways in which language can encounter other languages, and the way it brings all of those different languages together. So for me, this was it's become like a talismanic book for me to think about what translation is, not just as in a literary sense, but also as a metaphor for thinking about different works and how they become our own. thinking about different ways in which we can approach what some might think of as others. Because when, Mireille Gansel comes across Vietnam and Vietnamese and poetry and thinks about sound in relation to what she already knows about, poetry and in other languages, she comes to a realization of humanity, a shared humanity. And she does it in Rose's translation, which I adore, so quietly and powerfully that you simply just want to keep writing down every sentence again and work with it to see how it can yield more meanings to your own life. So, for me, this book does something which people talk about often but rarely can do, which I think Dolores touched on as well, which was listening with attention to yourself, but also to others, to see how in the listening a third experience can be found. And it is something that the book itself touches on, that to really translate, one has to be rooted in both worlds equally and firmly. And then from that, something new can grow. And I think that's a very hopeful statement against a book which takes in such huge ravages of war across a great geography of the world. And despite the way that it's underpinned by fascism and violence and the divisions of walls and, screens and tongues, it somehow undoes those things just by, not only by the way it thinks about language and talks about language and translation, but transhumance, which is such a great part of it. So it's really rooting its experience of humanity in a wider conversation, which I think is very important for us to have, and that's the natural world. Our relationship through language to this idea of mountains and rivers, to sheep, the way we're custodians in a way of these animals, and yet they lead us and we follow them as well to different kinds of meanings. It's so rare to come across a book which does all of this in such a scant amount of space that one just simply is in awe of it, as well as sort of having an experience of loving it, which I think both the other panelists have touched on as well. What can I say more about it? On a personal note, I've always felt slightly exiled from all the different ways in which I am in the world, or am understood or comprehended. And I think a book like this creates affinity for people who feel that way. So instead of finding that community in other people, we can find it in this book. And that's why it becomes such an important friend in my life. And I have, a small pile of books, which I probably would take anywhere to my desert island. I could never narrow them down to 3, but I probably would say 10 if I was lucky to have a boat that would hold them. This one would be the top of the pile, because in exile, one needs these kinds of friends, which bring so generously the rest of the world onto the page. Probably some of the books on that pile, Dolores has translated into Catalan before. So it is this question of thinking about violence and universality, and how we undermine violence and separation and division through working out what is it in languages that gives us that universality of experience, and how we can use those languages to think about something which is very close to my heart, which is the poetic compression of language and the way it can be used to yield different meanings in English as well as in different tongues, and where those places meet each other and how something new can be formed. I'm afraid I'm not going to read, and I feel a bit bad about that. Maybe I could.
Please don't, Preti, but did you want to go on?
No, I think I'll leave it there. Maybe just to find one page in which a lot of what I have said is encapsulated with far more beauty than I've said it, by Mireille, and translation by Rose herself. Lands of imprisonment become lands of the universal through the power of poetry. The voice of the poet, deep and low, so restrained and wounded that it seemed to be speaking only to the deserted paths. In this internal exile, every morning was precarious. Poetry was his recourse and place of ultimate resistance, his inner country. Is the frozen river still breathing faintly through the throat of the reed? As I worked closely alongside the poet to hone my translations, I listened to the silence of the empty house echoing through his words, the murmur of the tall maples where the stigmata of autumn burns. I learned the accents of an interior language, a language of poetry experienced and shared at the source itself, the very place where it is under threat.
Thank you, Preti. You had already shared so many wonderful thoughts with us. I wonder, we're now going to, we're going to move into a more general discussion among the panel. But could I, at this point, encourage our audience to contribute your questions via the Q&A function in particular. I see we have had a couple come through already. We'll come on to your questions after a brief discussion within the panel, because, firstly, I wonder if Dolors, if you'd like to come back to Preti on anything she's just been saying.
I think the point about inner language, interior language, is something that recurs throughout the book that Mireille talks about a lot. And it's this sense of a language that defies all borders, that is something that is very much who a person is, their identity. And just to, I think, add to what Dolores said, that this book had a profound influence on my own practice. I think it sort of summed up all the things that I sort of hazily sense about translation, but hadn't put into so many words. And the notion of empathy is incredibly important, and seeking out the authors. Mireille herself always, her mission was to give voice to persecuted writers and poets, and she would seek them out, and often at great risk to herself, in order to bring their voices over. And that was something that became very important to me, to seek out the author where possible and hear their voice and bring their voice over.
I'm very interested in this question of the impact of the book on your practice. Preti, I'll come back to you in a moment, because I'd be interested to know whether your love of the book has had an influence on your own writing. I wonder if Ros and Dolors, I could ask first, though, whether you were consciously trying to translate the book in line with the book's own principles. Did it affect your translation practice? Did you find yourself translating this book in perhaps a slightly a different way from other books that you've translated?
Well, I did, but especially because it was in French and not in English. So that was an important motive for me. But I think it has changed not so much the way of translating in general, but the way of approaching a book. I think it's important how she makes this approximation to the authors, to the text she's translating. That in that sense, it has changed a bit my way of looking at translation.
Yeah, for me, I think it was liberating in a way, because her insistence on translating what's underneath the words, the spirit of what's being said, rather than the letter, which is something that I've always done, but I think it pushed me further in that direction of really understanding what was being said. And also, I think because the poetry of her language, it's deceptively simple, and the sound was so important. So I worked a lot on music rather than meaning. So when I did my first draft translation, I was very attentive when revising it to how it sounded, and revising it with an ear to the music of language. So sometimes I would depart from the French in order to have something in English that was true to the spirit, but went a little bit further in terms of the sounds.
We should say as well that the book is in French, but it includes a great deal of German, German poems, which are then translated by Gansel into French. It includes Vietnamese poems. It includes shorter extracts of Hungarian. We heard the Hungarian words in the opening, and Hebrew. And so it's a multilingual text, and that must have been made it that much more difficult to translate.
For me, especially the Nelly Sachs, the poems of Nelly Sachs, no? Because they were translated into French by Mireille. I had to translate it into Catalan, but looking at English, looking at German, I mean, I had to make it was very interesting, but at the moment I was very, very nervous, thinking, well, what I am doing here, no? Because translating from French, a poem written in German, and then I told Mireille that I was a little bit upset by this operation. And she wrote to me saying, well, every translation enriches a text. So these poems of Nelly Sachs will be enriched by your intervention in Catalan. Well, she said always things like that you felt, well, you can do whatever you want with this translation. Whatever you feel, you can uphold.
For me, it wasn't so problematic because there are very, very good English translations of Nelly Sachs by Michael Hoffman. So it was more a research job of finding existing translations. For the Hungarian, I recruited a Hungarian translator to help me with the pronunciation and the meanings. So I drew on the hive mind. And for the Vietnamese, I translated it from Mireille's French, but I went back to her to check that what I'd done was actually a proper translation of the Vietnamese. So I worked very closely with her on the Vietnamese.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you both. I just had a brief freeze there. Apologies. I think we're having a thunderstorm, so I hope it doesn't affect things more severely. Preti, can I come back to you and ask about the impact of the book and your reading of the book on your own writing? Because I know that the work that you've just been finishing deals with some very graphic themes of violence and terrorism. And Gansel's book is also, it's in the background is always the Holocaust and the impact that fascism and the Holocaust had on her family and her extended family.
It's interesting that you mentioned that. I think, this book has had such a profound effect on my work in the sense that if I might just talk briefly about my first book, We That Are Young is what I call a translation of Shakespeare's King Lear, and it's set in contemporary India. And I must say that I agree with Ros that there's a sort of opening out where it's liberating to read this book by Mireille, because when I first published the novel, I was very much struck by how it was sort of undecipherable about where it sat. It was not a post-colonial novel. It was not an Indian writer writing in English because I was born in England. It was very difficult to be categorized in that sense. It wasn't an adaptation of Shakespeare. It wasn't an appropriation of Shakespeare because there was no sort of answering back to Leah in that way. And then I started thinking about what I was actually doing as a writer because I was able to read this book. And it gave me that sense of liberation and permission. And we were talking earlier about how it's not theory, but it gave me theory. It gave me language to think about this work of being a mixed hybrid person born in Britain with Indian, South Asian roots, with all this different kind of language and culture, bringing that feeling of hybridity to bear on Shakespeare, which is the canon, and making something new at the sentence level in English, in all the languages that I use in We That Are Young. And then I just realized that, it was a translation because of the way that Mireille writes about translation. And she writes about it as metaphor. She writes about it as poetry. She thinks through poetry and Shakespeare's, compressed language. It's puns, it's oral puns, it's different registers, it's thinking about social justice. She thinks through all of that through the prism of translation. So I felt permission in myself to say, okay, this is a translation and I'm making something with it. And that feels really good, because then as a writer, you get to say, actually, I know who I am and I know what I'm doing, which is kind of a privilege after a debut, which I really needed at that time, because otherwise you're just open to anyone kind of saying, it doesn't fit this genre, it doesn't fit that genre. But we're trying to work here in a way which I feel, she captures a vanishing world where people want to find community and connection despite these great horrors that you've mentioned, and come to the other by discovering what it really does mean to listen and to dissolve that category of otherness. You asked me about the new work, and I think when we read Translation of Transhumance, we have to think about how we can make art after violence and how we can speak about violence through poetry. What is the ethics of doing that? And she does it while asking the question. I can't say too much about Aftermath, but I will say that it does try to wrestle with that question, because, after terrorist violence, this sort of shattering that occurs, one has to find a way to rebuild. And if language has ended because of trauma, then where do we go? And this book, Translation as Transhumance, gives us a route to think about that.
Thank you, Preti. I noticed that the question from our audience, which is at the top of the list with most preferences, rather covers the ground that you've just been discussing in talking about We That Are Young. Let me read out the question, though, from Yvette Siegert. I wept when I read this book, and like Roz, felt that it had been written for me, and also that it was a book I wish I'd written. Thank you all for your insights into it. My question is for Preti. Critics have described We That Are Young as a retelling of King Lear, We That Are Young, a book I also love. I wonder if we might think of this as a rich, complex form of translation. If so, I wonder if you could talk more about this broader notion of translation or how Gansel's work stimulates your practice as a novelist. I think your previous answer covered that question. I don't know if there's anything more that you would want to say in response to Yvette's question.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and thank you so much for your kind words about my book. It's what you touched on in terms of this, retelling of King Lear. I think that's just critical laziness, if I may be so bold, because this is a way, and this is something that Translation of Transhumance insists on. It just insists on having different side by side. There is no hierarchy of difference. And I think that is so profound and so important. So, if you come to a book that sort of, you can see the architecture of something like King Lear, or let's say you're rewriting the Odyssey, or reinterpreting, or however a writer might choose to define that project, what you have to ask is, what is the other side bringing to that? So, in my personal novel, there is this kind of insistence on the Indian sacred texts and the Hindi language and Punjabi language. There's an insistence on Urdu poetry sitting side by side with the Shakespeare at the sentence level. And one can say, it's a retelling of King Lear, but you just miss that insistence on placing this thing in an equal relationship, which I think translation as Transhumance does so well.
Duncan, could I just say something there? I think what's really interesting about this book is that it has had an effect on all sorts of people. A lot of visual artists have written to me and said that it resonated with them. So it's not just a book about translation for translators. It touches a chord with writers and visual artists and musicians as well.
Thank you, Ros. Yes, it is a book which is so interested in kind of art, the arts in the round, isn't it? In the way in which translation is not just a textual operation. It's not even just a cultural operation in the sense of kind of transferring X to Y. It's something. It's a book that's in search. It strikes me as a book that's in search all the while of a way of capturing its own practice, really, of capturing Mireille's own practice as a translator and doing full justice to the activity of translation. Transhumance is a wonderful metaphor, precisely because, as we were saying before, it brings translation back into contact with the physical, with the landscape through this wonderful image of the flock moving to a new pasture. We've a question about precisely that, the title image, though, from Tamar Drucker. And Tamar asks, can I ask everyone to comment on the image of transhumans? The movement of livestock across land is usually repetitive, circular, seasonal, whereas the movement of people, stroke their words, from one language to another does not take them back the following spring. So I suppose it's a question of how far can one really take the title image, or would that be a quibble? I don't know. Translation as transhumance, is this a single movement, or is it circular?
My image is that we go, translators as a sheep, go from one place to another to eat, to get nourishment, and we come back to our language or whatever, to say what we found there. I think it's a quite proper image. Even when at the beginning I didn't like it, I didn't like the title. I thought, well, the title is the only thing I found very strange. But then when she explains it when she talks about René Char, by the paths of Provence, and she finds the sheep going to the mountains and all that. I found it fantastic, this chapter, no? And I like the title. And
I think it works on several levels. I think Preti used the word custodians, so translators as the custodians of language and taking language across borders. And Mireille talks about Provençal as being the umbrella language of all those different Mediterranean cultures, and poetry being the umbrella language. So I think it works on so many levels. I love it as an image.
Yeah, me too. And I think, it's not necessarily describing, for me, she's describing a practice, a writing practice. When I read that, like I said, I'm not a literary translator, but this idea of moving to one place and then coming back and then circling back around and then going over it again. And then, it's very repetitive. It's certainly my writing practice feels very repetitive, and it happens every day, and it's relentless, really. So in many ways, it's capturing what it actually means to engage with writing as a sort of way of moving across borders, perhaps.
And the encounters and the hospitality, I mean, that's a big theme for Mireille, is translation as hospitality. And the shepherds moving the flocks would encounter all sorts of different people and receive hospitality. So, it works again and again for me.
And it's not as though translation is a single kind of single action which takes you from A to B and then you stop. It's a to and fro all the time, isn't it? And I think for me, what's interesting about the image is the way it's a striking image, and it invites us, as all striking images do, if we've not been thinking in that way before, it invites us to start thinking in that way. It invites us to explore that image and to think, well, how suitable might it be? And I think we've all responded with that kind of sense of delight that actually, you know what, that does capture something really rather good and rather profound and rather right about what the process of translation actually is. It is, Dolors was saying, it's a kind of problematic term in some ways. Yes, it is. It's an unusual term. If you Google it, then you end up in all kinds of trouble, don't you? Because Google thinks you're looking for translation as transhuman, and gives you all kinds of dud results, although that's in itself an interesting question, but a rather different one. I think the more we talk about translation as transhumans, the more Google will learn from its mistakes.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you for those initial questions. Do keep your questions coming. Here is, in fact, this was the first question from Charles Laughlin. And this is a question about Mireille's translation practice. This is when I was summarizing the book at the opening, and Charles immediately responded with an interesting question. Hearing the structure of the book, the author's various experiences, including sojourns in East Germany and Vietnam, seems to imply a significant encounter or engagement with socialism and its literature. I wonder if there is an explicit discussion of this in the book, or whether the panelists have thought about the impact of Cold War politics / socialism on translation and our conception of it, with its overdetermined symbols of walls and iron and bamboo curtains, and the generally limited impact and accessibility of socialist literature in advanced industrial countries. Charles says, I work on modern Chinese literature, so this is a major issue in our field. So there are a number of aspects to the question there. We've touched a bit on the Mireille's reasons for these particular languages, for going to Vietnam and wanting to work on that anthology of Vietnamese poetry, specifically in response to McNamara's boast about bombing them back to the Stone Age, and a cultural response to that obscenity. But the question then of, I suppose, socialism and translation, the metaphors that are used, metaphors of walls, iron, bamboo, curtains, and the translation of socialist literature.
I don't think that Mireille's mission was to translate socialist writers. It was to give voice to persecuted writers and writers who were silenced. I mean, that was her mission, was to really give voice and make those writers known outside the frontiers of their own country. So she went to Czech Republic, she went to East Germany, she went to places where writers were silenced. I don't think there's no discussion really of politics as such. Her politics is about giving voice to writers. That was my reading of it. I don't know about you, Dolors and Preti.
Yeah, you do. Mm-hmm.
I think I agree with you. I don't see anything specific in this. I think her politics lies in her keen awareness of the fact that she had that freedom of movement, and she used it to seek out writers who did not have that necessarily, and her words had freedom of movement, which theirs did not have. And she, instead of kind of talking about her own journey as such, again, it's very much Levinisian in some ways, that the other is the one next to me. She puts herself alongside people who need that friend to make sure that their work and their worlds do reach a world which people like to think is more civilized. And so I think the politics is there, but it's really there in that sense.
I think her politics is in her life, in her way of living and her way of translating. And for instance, I think it's very important for her, the last chapter, which is about Eugenie Goldstern, who went for the valleys of Switzerland. And she gives a lot of importance to this woman and this kind of way of make living the new languages, the dialects. And I think that's very important. And it's a way of living, a way of fighting politics in life. No? So,
It is a very political book in some ways, but certainly not a party political book, is it? I mean, it's not banging the drum for a particular ideology, but there are all kinds of should we say kind of political with the small p themes that come through around translation. Translation itself can be a political activity. The translator is a kind of activist. Mireille has been over her career a translator with a very from a very ethical position, and wanting to translate to support causes, but they're causes of those who are marginalized, those who are, as Ros is saying, those who are marginalized, those who are exiled. And she's interested. I unfortunately haven't had the opportunity to meet Mireille myself, but I've had a little correspondence around this session, and it's very clear how pleased she has been with her with Ros and Dolors translations, and she particularly has been interested in Dolors translating her book into a minority language, into Catalan, and she is very keen to reach out not only to speakers of major world languages, but also to those speakers of less translated languages.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That makes me very, very happy, this attitude of Mireille, because she's so happy with Catalan translation. I think, well, that's not usual at all. So it's nice.
And she seems to be able to read Catalan. Is that right? Did you work with her on the translation, Dolors?
Yes, she didn't know Catalan, but now I see that she understands many things that I say. So I think she's going to get a very good Catalan in a few days. No, I don't know, but she has a dictionary, a Catalan dictionary. So she's very interested in it. So very nice.
Ros, Mireille certainly has good English, it seems to me. Did you work with her on the translation?
I mean, one of the things about Mireille's generosity is that she gave me free rein. I was so anxious about this book. I wanted to get it right, and I wanted to send her the translation. And she said, no, I completely trust you. She came to a workshop when I was at sort of the early stages of the translation. I did a workshop at a summer school I was involved in Cambridge, and invited her, and we workshopped part of the text. And when she saw how I was approaching it, she just said, it's yours now. You do what you need to do, which again was very liberating. But I'm here if you need me. So I only deferred to her if there was something I didn't understand, if I wanted explanation of, or for the Vietnamese. And one of the things I wanted to add about her is her humility and her willingness to question herself. There's one part where she talks about a word she translated 30 years earlier and had second thoughts about. And so this continual questioning of her own practice. And I thought, I think this is very political. When she was talking about the translation of Vietnamese, and she looked at existing translations into French of Vietnamese writers, and there was a kind of exoticism going on, and how she was appalled at this way of othering those writers, and developed a whole different practice, and even learned to play the monochord to capture the music of the Vietnamese language. So I think this continual questioning, and I think she herself had started translating Vietnamese in that fashion and realized she had to go completely back to the drawing board. And her practice is constantly evolving as she challenges her own assumptions. And that humility is incredibly moving, and certainly makes me question my own translation more.
I have a question, if I may. Please. About this issue of being moved as a translator by the work you're working on. I mean, with this book, obviously, and I think someone wrote this in the chat as well, that they wept when they read it, and I certainly have a kind of lump in my throat when I talk about it. But when you're actually working with this text, you have to stop and kind of take deep breaths, or how do you manage with this kind of work emotionally?
It's difficult to say. I don't know.
Dolors, do you want to speak to that?
I don't know what to say. I really was moved by the text, but I could keep on translating. I mean, I didn't have to stop to. I was thinking a lot. This text made me think a lot, and I still thinking. But I didn't. I don't know. It didn't change my way of working.
I mean, in a way, it's pure joy to get up in the morning and work on something like that. And it's also terrifying because you so want to get it right.
Yeah.
So it's this mixture of elation and terror.
There is a thing I would like to say that this book, there is this story, this chapter that talks about Bertolt Brecht and his wife that is representing Antigona. It's very interesting. There is in these sentences she says that they are a compendium of theory of translation. And she says the Bagel, the wife of Brecht, doesn't interpret. She is the interpreter. And I think it's a great lesson of translation. You don't have to interpret anything, but you have to be the interpreter, no? Just to let the other interpret it. I find this bit very, very interesting and very nice.
That's one of the more sort of general themes that the book addresses, isn't it? The relation between translation and interpretation. And she comes back to that theme later on in the book, doesn't she? I'm thinking towards the end, she dwells on the German word deuten, to interpret, and she's very interested in the Jewish tradition of exegesis, of scriptural exegesis, isn't she? And the different ways in which a scriptural passage can be interpreted. And again, she's likening the work of the translator to the scriptural exegete in that sense, isn't she? The translator then, as reader and as interpreter, in so many different ways as in producing the translation, and for the translation then to carry these different senses with it if possible.
Mm-hmm. So in a translation, you can't have endless glosses. So the translation itself has to be the exegesis because it has to be in your translation.
Yeah. Yes.
Indeed. We've had not a Q&A, but a chat comment from Yvette saying, I'm thinking to be moved linguistically is like being translated. So I think being moved propels us to create, whether as poets, translators, or novelists, etc. Metaphor itself is a word that in Greek means movement. Metaphor is synonymous with translation itself. We've got a question about metaphor, which I'd like to come back to perhaps in conclusion. But we have a question from Fiona Graham about translating the Vietnamese poems in particular. To what extent did you listen to the original Vietnamese to gain a sense of the rhythm and musicality of the texts? How exactly do you go about translating a poem in a language you don't speak yourself? Did Mireille Gansel give a full explanation of all the nuances of the original?
There wasn't much in Vietnamese, and that's what I worked with Mireille on. And they were quite, I couldn't capture the music because it was on the page, but they were quite simple. So I first of all just translated what the French said, and then I went back to Mireille to see whether there was anything that needed to change or if I'd missed anything.
I was listening to a recording of the I think Mireille sent us a recording of a woman, of a Vietnamese woman reading her poems. So I had that, but I did that from French. I didn't. I couldn't. It's the same thing when she says that Nelly Sachs has a kind of German with Hebrew with Hebrew, I don't know, with the language of Israel. I mean, she says is a mixture of Hebrew and German. I couldn't see that. It's impossible for me to see the Hebrew in the German of Nelly Sachs. No? There are things that a translator can't do, I think.
I was when I was reading the book, I was thinking it's a pity we don't have a representative of the publishers here, because it must have been a difficult book to typeset with the Vietnamese and all the different languages. It's difficult enough for translators, but to be able to publish a multilingual book like this is also a feat as well, and to be able to proof it and so on. The idea of poetry, of sounds, of translating sounds is a recurrent one in the book, isn't it? And also the notion of translating silence. And rather like I teach Walter Benjamin and his work on translation to our MA students. And Benjamin, of course, is very interested in the mystical tradition, the Jewish mystical tradition. And I found some of that interest coming through in Gansel as well. She's so interested in reading and translating between the lines, if you like, and so getting beyond simply the letter on the page. I think, Ros, you were referring to it earlier on, the spirit rather than the letter. But what exactly does that mean? And the notion of translating the silences and the translation as addressing the silences is, I think, a really powerful one.
I think that's really difficult to explain, but you feel that you are translating silences. In this book especially, you have this feeling, no? But it's difficult to say how you do that, no?
I think there's a point where you become inhabited by the book. So the first sort of half of the translation is you're struggling. It's like wading through a very muddy field with heavy boots on, and every word, every sentence is it's a plod. And then there's a point for me, and it happens with every book, where it's almost physical. Something happens in my body where I feel a kind of ownership and authority, where I feel that the voice has come through, and I feel more confident in what I'm doing, and I just wait for that to happen. And that's where you get the rhythms, the silences, and you get underneath the words.
I think this brings me back, I think, it brings you back to the image of the sheep and the rain and the mountain and the road, and this pastoral nature of silence, where it can hold a lot of different things, beings, but no one is actually using words to communicate. And, that's again why this image is so speaking, because when we think about being in the countryside surrounded by this, like it's not a kind of, it's a rainy day. It's got all of these animals in it jostling around, and one would say that was a silent job, being a shepherd and taking these sheep across vast tracts of land. And yet one would hear so much music of nature in that journey. And I think, obviously you touched on how Mireille learned the instruments, the Vietnamese instruments, to understand the poetry. So there's a lot of kind of work with unspeaking instruments that don't use language, but also capture this idea that silence contains all of this noise as well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The book contains a number of poems. The book is about poetry translation very centrally, but I'm struck as well, certainly in the English edition, by how the book is really almost set out like a book of poetry. The chapters are quite short, and there's the publisher has been very generous in giving the book the space to breathe, including the blank space, and in a sense it repays our attention as readers to almost read it like a book of poetry. It seems to me. There are a number of further questions which I'd like to address if we can. Alison Wright has written a couple of questions. I'll perhaps ask one, which is, we do revisit concepts in previous translations or journeys when we confront new language that we need to translate. We bring all of our experience to any translation. So previous translations have a resonance in the act of any translation done in the present. Would participants agree? So we revisit concepts and previous translations. We bring all of our experience to any new translation. I suppose, one way of asking that question would be, you are, addressing Ros and Dolors here, but you are very experienced translators. Are you glad that you translated this book at this stage in your careers, when you had that practice as translators to draw on? Because it's clearly it's an extraordinarily challenging book in many ways. And did you feel that you needed your experience to draw on as translators in working with the book?
I suppose we did, yes. I think I normally, when I start the book for a translation, I always think, I don't know if this time I will be able to finish it. I know that I will be, because I was, but not. You start always at the beginning when you start the book. No, I suppose it's like writing, that you always start. You know that you can do it because you have done it, but no. But maybe you doubt, well, this time I'm sure I will go anywhere. No?
I think for me, every new book, I feel like a beginner again, because it's different from everything else I've done. But I suppose what I have learned over the years is to be much more careful and slower, and to rethink and question. When I think about the sort of things I did when I was starting out, I would race through a book. I was completely oblivious to some of the challenges. And I recently revised a book that I translated 30 years ago, and it was republished. So I asked if I could have a quick look at it before it went out, and I had to completely redo it. So I guess I've learned something over the years. And the main thing that I've learned is to go slowly, very slowly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that is a myth, you know. When you people know that you're an experienced translator, they say, "Oh, you've done so many books, you must be really fast by now." Look, I can't tell you how many times I've had that said to me, and the answer is no, I'm not really fast. I'm really slow.
Yeah, you have to go slowly, like a man taking sheep across mountains.
Absolutely.
I think it's really difficult to translate, really, and then. Well, you know, I think I had found it more difficult as I get older. As I grew older, it's more difficult for me to translate. I don't know why, but it's like that. I have the experience, but I have the difficulty, I suppose. Well, the ignorance is very good for working now. I don't know.
I suppose it's the Socratic truth, isn't it? That the older you get, the more you know you don't know.
I think that's that really.
There's a final question I think that we can take from Jenny Harris, and I mentioned this is about metaphor. Jenny says, my favorite thing about Gansel's book is her insistence on metaphor as absolutely key to understanding what translation is, and possibly the only way to approach describing this mysterious process. Jenny asks, what are your favorite translation metaphors? So if we perhaps bracket transhumance for this question, would you like to comment on translation and metaphor? What are your favorite translation metaphors? That's putting you on the spot, isn't it?
I've got a couple. For me, one is it's like doing a Rubik's Cube, because you start moving things around and one thing works and another thing doesn't. So you're always doing this with the words. And the other is being on a sort of tightrope between the reader and the writer. So while you're paying great attention to the writer and what they have written, you're also thinking about your reader. And there's this continual sort of tension where you're being sort of pulled between the two. So those are my two metaphors.
Thank you, Rose.
I don't know what metaphor. Well, it's the very easy metaphor is the one of the interpreter of music, no? The one who have the music there. But I think it's different, because in translation, the language disappears completely. So I find it very, very strange, very mysterious what happens in translation, because it disappears, everything disappears, and then starts again, and then it's the same book. It's something so incredible. No? What
Yeah, I think it's time for us to look at your aphorisms that you had pulled out of the book itself, Duncan. That seems to be my response. I want to know what the book said.
Yes.
Yes. I could certainly share my screen again, just to, in conclusion, with some of these quotations. We've heard the first of these already. No word that speaks of what is human is untranslatable. Language of memory, language of the mind, language without a home, language in exile. Thinking of metaphors in particular, a beautiful metaphor of language of the soul, language without a home, salvaged language. A conversation with Imre Kertész, talking about the German of the Austro-Hungarian empire, an impregnable territory which no barbed wire fence, no watchtower will ever be able to restrict or enclose, over which no barbarism will ever be able to cast its shadow. As you can see, these are just from the opening pages of the book on approaching Brecht's poetry. How do you bridge the abyss created in the German language by the barbed wire fences and watchtowers of history? How do you reach the shores of a language of the soul? I won't go through, but there are plenty more where that came from. I think we need to wrap up, unless Ros, you had a favorite quotation there which we didn't touch on.
No, I would just say, if you want to see the rest of it, buy the book.
I think that kind of takes us back to where we started, really, which is exactly, this is a fabulous book. Do get a copy if you haven't already. And so I'd refer you to the link that I put in the chat right at the beginning. So, up. Thank you to all our audience for your attention and for your really great questions. I'm glad we were able to, we had the time this evening to discuss so many of them. Thank you to all my panelists, to Preti, to Dolors, and to Ros. Thank you in absentia, of course, to Mireille herself, who I'm glad was able to be represented, at least through her words of welcome. This is, as I mentioned, this is a panel which is part of our BCLT Summer School. There are two more public events on Thursday and on Friday, which you may like to check out and sign up for if you haven't already. Otherwise, our summer school will continue tomorrow and through till Saturday morning. So it remains for me only to thank all my panelists again for your wonderful contributions this evening. Thank you to our audience once again, and we'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Duncan, and enjoy the rest of the summer school, everybody.